You wake up at 3 in the morning with that familiar pit in your stomach, the one that tells you something is fundamentally wrong, but you cannot quite put your finger on what it is. You start to wonder if it would be easier to just nod along, to think the same thoughts as everyone else, to finally belong somewhere without having to explain yourself or defend your perspective every single time you open your mouth. This is something much deeper, something that Jean Piaget spent decades studying, and something that most people never realize is slowly eating away at their cognitive development every single day. When you suppress that voice inside you that sees things differently, when you force yourself to accept conclusions that do not feel right in your gut, when you choose harmony over truth, you are not just being socially appropriate, you are engaging in a form of cognitive self-destruction that Piaget identified as one of the most dangerous threats to intellectual development. Your creativity withers because original thinking requires the exact kind of cognitive independence that social conformity destroys. Most devastating of all, you begin to lose access to what Piaget called formal operational thinking, the highest level of cognitive development that allows humans to think abstractly, to consider multiple possibilities simultaneously, to question assumptions, and to construct new knowledge rather than simply absorbing what others tell them is true. The discomfort you feel when your thinking diverges from the crowd is not a signal that you are wrong. It is a signal that your mind is working exactly as it should. That tension, that cognitive dissonance, that feeling of being out of step with everyone around you, these are not problems to be solved by conforming. They are the very mechanisms through which intellectual growth happens. In 1952, Jean Piaget encountered a 7-year-old boy named Marcel in his laboratory at the University of Geneva who would fundamentally change how we understand the relationship between social conformity and cognitive development. The parents described a child who would ask why water took the shape of its container, who wanted to understand why some objects floated while others sank, who refused to accept "because that is how it works" as a satisfactory explanation for anything he encountered in his daily life. What the parents saw as a behavioral problem, Piaget recognized as something extraordinary. During their first session together, Piaget presented Marcel with a classic conservation task, showing him 2 identical glasses filled with the same amount of water, then pouring one glass into a taller, thinner container while Marcel watched. He stared at both containers for several minutes, moving his hands as if he were measuring the air, and then announced that the amount of water had to be the same because nothing had been added or taken away. He said he could imagine the water being poured back into the original container, and it would fill it exactly as before, demonstrating what Piaget called reversibility, the ability to mentally manipulate objects and scenarios in ways that go beyond immediate sensory experience. But what happened next was even more revealing. The other children, following typical developmental patterns, all concluded that the taller container held more water and began trying to convince Marcel that he was wrong. Marcel began to waver, not because his reasoning had changed, but because the weight of group consensus was creating what Piaget called cognitive conflict, the uncomfortable tension between what his developing logical abilities told him was true and what social harmony seemed to require him to accept. If Marcel gave in to this pressure and accepted the group's conclusion, despite his own logical reasoning, he would not just be making a social choice, he would be actively damaging the neural pathways that were developing to support abstract thought. Piaget continued working with Marcel over several months, documenting how social pressure affected different aspects of his cognitive development. In scientific reasoning tasks, Marcel demonstrated advanced hypothesis testing abilities when working alone, but reverted to random trial and error when group consensus seemed to favor less systematic approaches. The boy who had once questioned everything was becoming increasingly passive, increasingly likely to look for external validation before trusting his own reasoning, increasingly disconnected from the very cognitive abilities that had made him exceptional in the first place. This pattern repeated itself across hundreds of children that Piaget studied over the following decades. More troubling still, Piaget found that many of these children never recovered their earlier cognitive momentum, carrying patterns of intellectual dependence and conformity into adulthood that prevented them from ever reaching their full cognitive potential. Piaget realized that he was documenting a fundamental conflict between social survival and intellectual growth, a conflict that most people never recognize because they have learned to suppress the very cognitive abilities that would allow them to see it clearly. But those same social functions can be devastating to cognitive development if they are not balanced with opportunities for independent thought and intellectual risk-taking. You know this feeling intimately, even if you have never connected it to Piaget's research. Did you speak up immediately, or did you wait to see if anyone else would voice similar concerns first? Did you find yourself wondering if you were seeing problems that were not really there, or if your perspective was somehow skewed because it differed so dramatically from what everyone else seemed to be thinking? This is exactly what Piaget was studying in his laboratory. Your brain was being forced to choose between social harmony and intellectual integrity, between belonging and growing, between the safety of conformity and the uncertainty of independent thought. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who seemed completely satisfied with explanations that left you with more questions than answers? Se isso ressoa com você, deixe comentário simples. I refuse to stop thinking for myself. What Piaget discovered about Marcel and hundreds of other children was that this discomfort, this sense of being cognitively out of step with others, is not a personal failing or a social handicap. The tragedy is that most people interpret this discomfort as a signal to conform, rather than as a signal to continue growing. And in doing so, they abandon the very cognitive development that would allow them to contribute something unique and valuable to the world. The first type involves perceptual conformity, where people learn to distrust their own sensory experience when it conflicts with what others claim to perceive. The second type involves logical conformity, where people abandon sound reasoning strategies when those strategies produce conclusions that differ from group consensus. Marcel demonstrated this pattern when he stopped using proportional reasoning in mathematics problems after other children expressed confusion about his approach. The third type involves what Piaget called epistemic conformity, the tendency to accept authorities' claims about what can and cannot be known, rather than testing those limits through independent investigation. The fourth and most devastating type involves metacognitive conformity, where people learn to distrust their own thinking processes and rely on others to tell them not just what to think, but how to think. Piaget documented how each type of conformity creates specific patterns of cognitive damage that become self-reinforcing over time. People who accept external limits on what can be known stop developing their capacity for original investigation. People who distrust their own thinking processes become cognitively passive in ways that make independent thought increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. Instead, you make thousands of small decisions to soften your opinions, to doubt your perceptions, to defer to others' judgment, to avoid the social cost of intellectual disagreement. What makes this process particularly insidious is that it often accelerates precisely when people are in environments that should be promoting cognitive growth. Piaget found that many of the most cognitively gifted children he studied experienced their greatest intellectual stagnation during adolescence and early adulthood, when social pressure to fit in reached its peak intensity. But Piaget also discovered something hopeful that most people never realize. Through what he called genetic epistemology, the study of how knowledge develops over time, Piaget found that people could recover and continue developing their cognitive abilities even after years of conformity-induced stagnation, but only if they were willing to tolerate the social discomfort that independent thinking inevitably creates. When your thinking differs from the crowd, when your reasoning leads you to conclusions that others reject, when your questions challenge assumptions that others take for granted, you are experiencing exactly the kind of disequilibrium that promotes continued intellectual growth. Instead of seeing group pressure as something you need to resist through willpower or personality strength, you can recognize it as a natural force that serves important social functions, but that must be balanced with opportunities for independent cognitive development. Piaget found that people who successfully navigate this balance share certain characteristics that can be developed through intentional practice. They maintain what he called intellectual humility, recognizing that their individual perspective is limited, while still trusting their ability to reason about what they observe. They cultivate what Piaget called active skepticism, the habit of testing ideas through exploration and experimentation rather than accepting or rejecting them based on social consensus. This distinction allows them to be socially responsive without being intellectually passive, to maintain relationships without sacrificing their cognitive development, to belong to communities without surrendering their ability to think independently about complex problems. Piaget found that the most effective approach involves what he called progressive decentering, gradually expanding your ability to consider multiple perspectives simultaneously rather than trying to eliminate social influence altogether. Pay attention to the internal shift that happens when you move from thinking about a problem independently to thinking about how others might react to your conclusions. Observe how your questions become less probing, your analysis less thorough, your conclusions less definitive when you are concerned about social acceptance. This does not mean ignoring social reality or becoming deliberately disagreeable, but it does mean protecting your cognitive processes from premature social editing. Piaget also emphasized the importance of what he called experimental attitude, the willingness to test your ideas through action rather than just through social validation. This kind of empirical confidence is much more resilient than social confidence because it is based on direct experience rather than others' approval. They report feeling more authentic in their relationships because they are bringing their genuine thoughts and perspectives to social interactions rather than performing roles designed to maintain harmony. They feel more resilient in the face of social conflict because their sense of intellectual competence is not dependent on others' agreement. This confidence is not arrogance or closed-mindedness, but rather a mature recognition that their cognitive abilities, when properly developed and maintained, are capable of generating reliable knowledge about the world around them. When Piaget followed up with him years later, Marcel had become an engineer who was known for his ability to solve problems that others found impossibly complex. The path Marcel took was not about becoming antisocial or deliberately contrarian, but about learning to trust his cognitive abilities enough to let them operate freely even when doing so created temporary social discomfort. The result was a life characterized by continuous learning, creative problem-solving, and genuine intellectual contribution to his community. It is the evidence that your mind is developing exactly as it should, that you are progressing toward cognitive abilities that will allow you to contribute something unique and valuable to the world. The danger of thinking differently from the crowd is not that you will be wrong or that you will become socially isolated. When you suppress your natural intellectual curiosity, when you stop asking the questions that others find challenging, when you conform your thinking to match popular opinion, you are not just limiting your own potential, you are depriving the world of perspectives and insights that only you can provide. The same cognitive courage that Marcel needed to trust his reasoning about water conservation is the same courage you need to trust your perspective when it differs from everyone around you. Look, I understand the loneliness that comes with thinking differently, the exhaustion of constantly having to explain or defend perspectives that feel obvious to you but challenging to others. But what I have learned from studying Piaget's work is that this temptation, while understandable, leads to a kind of cognitive death that is far more devastating than any temporary social discomfort you might experience by thinking independently. When you suppress these natural cognitive abilities in service of social harmony, you are not just making a social choice, you are engaging in a form of intellectual self-destruction that will limit every aspect of your life going forward. But here is what gives me hope, and what should give you hope too. Every moment that you feel cognitively out of step with the people around you, every time you notice problems that others miss, every instance when your reasoning leads you to conclusions that challenge popular opinion, these are not signs that something is wrong with you. The path forward is not about becoming antisocial or deliberately difficult, but about learning to protect and develop your cognitive abilities while still maintaining the social connections that make life meaningful. Continue descobrindo como essas ideias se aplicam em sua vida. How you can develop the cognitive autonomy that Piaget identified as essential for intellectual fulfillment while still building the authentic relationships that make that fulfillment meaningful. Coming up next, we will explore how Piaget's discoveries about moral development reveal why following your conscience often puts you in direct conflict with social expectations, and more importantly, how to navigate that conflict without sacrificing either your integrity or your relationships.